It is election day, and many Americans are experiencing anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. Here to get us ready for the day and days ahead, we're joined by former political reporter and longtime election analyst and consultant John Daigle. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Ann. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for your willingness to be here today and tonight for our live election coverage. But this has been one of the most news filled, exciting, sometimes bizarre election seasons in American history.
It has. I mean, I've been covering politics and focused on politics for a long time. I don't ever remember a cycle like this. We all lived through the 2000 hanging Chad election and the 2020 post 2020 election period. But I don't think we've ever seen anything like this, especially in an election season where everything we read about and everything we study shows that it could come down to an incredibly small number of voters.
Yeah. And so, you know, vo Florida's got 2 time zones, obviously, so we're gonna have polls closing here at 7, on the West Coast then at 7, and so we may not see the first real chunk of statewide stuff until 8 o'clock. But what is it that you are going to be paying attention to first and foremost in the state of Florida?
Yeah, and as you pointed out, Florida is unique in that we have the two time zones. Florida is one of the states that allows election officials to begin sorting and prepping ballots to be counted before election day. So usually we get results from absentee votes and mail in votes pretty quickly, but state law says that they can't, that the whole state has to release them as one. And because our panhandle West Florida voters, their polls don't close till 8 o'clock Eastern time, we won't see the first results from mail-in ballots and early voting until after sometime probably between 8 and 8:30.
What about local results, though?
No, I don't think. Again, the first results that will come in are those mail-in ballots and the early voting, and I think all those will be posted at one time. So I don't think you'll see results on local elections. And again, the first results we'll see are those that big drop of the early voting and mail-in voting.
All right. And so we've been talking about Florida as a case of probably not always a purple state anymore. I mean, we're expecting that this is probably more of a red state just given the demographics of the GOP and voter registration.
Yeah, I mean, Florida used to be a fairly purple state. Over the last 10 years, the Republicans have really done a great job of voter registrations, and they've really worked hard on the ground game. They've built up about a 10-point advantage over the Democrats in terms of just pure voter registration. And early voting in Florida kind of reflects that. What we ended up in statewide with the Republicans with a little bit over a 10-point advantage in the early voting and the mail-in voting. So GOP advantage that they have should show up in that first drop. Um, I expect, that we've heard the terms the red mirage and the blue shift for a long time, and we'll likely see that in Florida because that 10-point advantage that the GOP has in Florida will show up in the early and absentee votes where that 10-vote advantage, and that's generally referred to as the red mirage, where those first votes drop, and it looks to Republicans like they're doing very well. And then as the night progresses and we get some more of the election day voters, you have what's described as the blue shift, where Democrats begin uh, overcoming those early numbers that the GOP typically has in Florida.
And I think supervisors of election have tried of late to make clear that that's not an indication that there's something wrong or that that's something fraudulent, but that really is just part of the process and skews to how people vote and who votes which way.
Yeah, and that has become a big problem, and again, especially in a race where one candidate is likely to declare victory prematurely, it's a problem, when that happens, and Republicans get, who aren't very familiar with the process, get very optimistic when they see those early numbers, and they think they've won the race, and then the classic blue shift starts happening, and a lot of people get very suspicious that something funny is going on because wait, we were just ahead by 10 points, and now it's even. It is something that happens. Now 2020 was an outlier because of COVID and the very odd patterns that we had with mail-in votes that year. But I think this year we're probably getting back to a more traditional patterns in what we see in terms of which party wins the early votes and which party wins election day.
We've talked about the party split when it comes to the type of voting, but you've actually dug into a gender gap that's emerged in early voting. Tell us a little bit about what we're seeing on how men and women are voting differently through through that means.
Yeah, and I have been looking at mainly the 7 swing states because I think, there's some things that could happen. I mean, there's some strange polling going on. We saw polling over the weekend where a state like Iowa could be in play, but I'm still focused mainly on what numbers I'm seeing in early voting.
And remind us what the swing states are.
So, basically, you've got 6 or 7, depending on how you look at it. I really think it's 7 states. You've got the 3 so-called blue wall states up in north, and that's Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, which almost no Democrat president has ever gotten into the White House without winning those 3 blue wall states. And I think I saw a number that goes back to like 1956 since a Democratic candidate, won the White House without those 3 blue wall states. And then you've got the Sun Belt swing states, which again is usually Georgia, Nevada, and in Arizona. But this year, I think a lot of people have thrown North Carolina into those Sun Belt swing states. So you've got North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona.
Yeah, and so you've been primarily looking at the gender gap as it impacts
Yeah.
early voting in those states. And what is it that you're finding?
Well, in almost all of those swing states, the women voters are in early voting have far outpaced men voters. I think I've seen anything from a 5 point to a 10 point advantage, depending on the state. Um, that again, some analysis says that that's a very good sign for Harris. The gender gap, especially with abortion being on the ballot in 10 states, and on the heels of Roe v. Wade, there's a lot of speculation that that gender gap that we're seeing in early voting and mail-in voting, and likely on election day, is good news for the Harris campaign.
Yeah. So there has been record voter turnout in some places. And I know just anecdotally, I waited in line for early voting for the first time ever since I've lived in Florida. And I've heard the same from a lot of people I know that they were waiting in lines for early voting. It does seem like there's a lot more people, but perhaps that is also just people shifting the way they vote.
It is. I mean, we have seen it. Mail-in ballots are coming back. We did see a significant drop off in mail-in ballots, especially in the last 2 cycles, when particularly on the Republican side, there's been doubts cast about the security of mail-in ballots and so forth. So we some of the numbers have shifted. Typically, we can expect to see about half the voters vote before election day. And in some states that have been, especially the swing states that have received a lot of the political advertising spending money, we have seen record numbers in the early voting. But it's hard to say whether we're still whether those early voters have cannibalized election day voters, or whether we're going to see an overall record turnouts in those states, or whether we're just seeing more votes coming in early. Uh, the Republicans have kind of come back to embrace. I mean, mail-in ballots used to be the primary territory for Republican voters, and then during the Trump years, I think there was some doubt cast on mail-in ballots, but it seems to be coming back now with GOP voters relying more heavily on mail-in ballots. We'll know today whether we're seeing just record early voting or whether record voting overall.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we are talking to political analyst John Daigle about election day or perhaps election week, as some are predicting. You can join our conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937 or email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also tag us on social media. You made a little nod there to spending. And John, as a longtime political consultant, from spending,
Yeah.
um, this has been a very big spending year on a couple of initiatives in Florida, particularly Amendment 3 and Amendment 4. That's the recreational marijuana and abortion.
Yeah, I mean, and good news for Florida broadcast companies because on the terms of the presidential race, we've seen almost nothing spent in Florida. We're not really considered a swing state, and really the only races that have seen significant spending in Florida is the Senate race between Scott and Marcuso Powell, and then Amendments 3 and 4. And in those areas, we've seen record numbers that we've never seen spending in election cycle like we have this cycle for on Amendments 3 and 4. And nationally, in terms of ballot initiatives, there's Florida has been second only to California in terms of spending on ballot initiatives. Uh, the recreational marijuana amendment has received significantly more than than the abortion amendment, but combined, it's I think the figure is something like 250 or a little bit over 250 million dollars combined on those, and which is just blows us out of the water, even compared to some of the big amendments we've seen in the past, like medical marijuana and felon voting, and some of the other very high profile amendments.
You're saying 250 million kind of on Amendment 4 and Amendment 3 jointly?
Yes,
Yeah, and we know
combined.
that a lot of the money has been coming for the amendment on marijuana from True Leave, which is a dispensary. They've, bankrolled a lot of the spending on Amendment 3,
Yeah.
but there's also been some state spending. Remind us what's happening there.
So, and let me correct myself because I looked at my notes. It's actually about 225 total, 225 million total on those. And you're right. The vast majority of the spending in favor of recreational marijuana, Amendment 3, has come from True Leave, which obviously has an economic interest in its passage. They're the primary provider of medical marijuana in Florida, and would have a huge business expansion if recreational marijuana was legalized. On the opposing side of that amendment, you've seen a sort of a collection of money. You've got PAC money in there, um, and which is normally where money comes from on the ballot initiatives. But you've also got a couple other sources of funding that have fought against that amendment that have raised some eyebrows. There's been an estimated $50 million in taxpayer money invested in defeating that amendment, and that's come from the Florida Department of Transportation and other Florida state agencies that have come under fire for spending taxpayer money trying to fight that amendment. Some of it has been pretty overt with outright vote no on Amendment 3, and then some have been more subtle with all of a sudden we're seeing commercials pop up with local sheriffs talk, including our own, talking about marijuana being bad. Doesn't mention the amendment, but there's been a lot of spending on some of the dangers of marijuana, which, again, yeah, the coincidence there is hard to ignore. But between the Republican Party of Florida putting in about $3.5 million, the PAC spending, and the state money, uh, the the anti-Amendment 3 forces have not quite matched the pro-amendment forces, but they've come pretty far in terms of matching the spending on that amendment.
A large part of that with the state money.
Yeah, I think the largest of the three pots was state money.
Yeah.
And of course, Governors DeSantis and First Lady Casey DeSantis have invested heavily in their own personal political capital in fighting that amendment.
Same with Amendment 4, the abortion amendment. That also has had a big chunk of state money that you estimate has paid for, tens of thousands of
Yeah,
television and radio ads.
yeah, and Department of Health and others have invested, and they've come under fire. There's been some legal challenges to that spending, but they have spent tens of millions of dollars in fighting that, which again is pretty unusual. I don't know that I've ever seen any election cycle where tax money was used in that way. I'm sure post-election there's going to be a lot of discussion about, whether or not that's appropriate. And again, I think depending on which way the vote goes on those amendments, if they both succeed as they're expected to, it will have a considerable take a considerable toll on Governor DeSantis' political capital.
Why is that? Explain to us how, he's obviously kind of term limited after this term. So how does it impact his clout?
Well, I mean, as I said, he's gone all in on that, and as has Casey DeSantis, and it's become a pretty interesting test of whether or not once he had his political power in Florida was pretty strong. I mean, he was the most coveted endorsement in Florida for many years. You've seen some breakoff among the Republican Party. You have some key Republican leaders in Florida, including former President Trump, who have become on the opposite side of DeSantis on this issue. You've had a lot
On
of local
marijuana
on the
specifically.
marijuana issue. Yeah, you've had a lot of local Republican sheriffs come out and do advertising saying it's time to pass this recreational marijuana amendment. So it's an issue where you see some defections within the Florida GOP. You see some split in that party over it, and with how heavily and personally DeSantis has invested himself in this, if it were to fail, I think a lot of people would say that's the beginning of his time as a lame duck governor.
So we know that Florida's threshold for passing a ballot amendment is higher than most places. It's a
Yeah.
60% threshold. I mean, do you care to forecast? Do you have any feeling about how these two amendments that
Yeah.
are getting so much attention might pan out?
I mean, history says that both going to pass. I mean, if you look at Florida's history, most amendments that get to the point where they're on the ballot, and it's not easy to get these amendments on the ballot, but once you get on the ballot and you get past all the legal challenges, and especially if you raise more money than your opposition, almost always those amendments pass. So history tell both the advocates for Amendment 3 and Amendment 4 have both raised and spent significant money, more than their opposition. And history tells us that both those, even with that high threshold of 60%, which is, as you point out, is not the same in other states, both of them I expect to reach that threshold.
I'm curious what you think about Amendment 1 in that respect. That's the one that would return school board races to partisan races.
Yeah.
Has not gotten as much attention, certainly has not gotten anywhere near the money, but do you think that that also will reach the threshold just given how kind of low on the totem pole it's been in terms of attention?
That one's trickier because, as you said, it's not gotten a lot of attention. Political insiders know a lot about it. If you're one of the few people who really follows politics closely, and the whole issue of is whether or not you want partisan politics involved in our local school board races. And of course, anybody who's paid any attention recently knows that whether we like it or not, partisan politics has become very much a part of our local school board races. But in that race, part of me says, obviously, with the GOP advantage, the GOP likes that amendment. They would like to see school board races partisan. And you could say that because of their voter registration advantage and their turnout, so far their turnout advantage, that would pass. However, the wild card there is independents. In Florida, you've got somewhere between 20 and 30% of voters are independents. And certainly that block of voters is not really keen on turning our
Mm,
local school board races into partisan,
interesting.
thing. So I really think that I'm not as confident on Amendment 1 because I think that that large chunk, as much as almost a third of voters who are independents or NPAs, are probably going to vote against that. And there's been very little money spent on it, and not many people know much about it. So if I had to place a bet, I don't think I'd be betting on passage of Amendment 1.
I want to ask you a little bit about some of the national Senate and House races because, in addition to the presidency being decided, those are going to be very consequential. They're very, very close chambers. And, Florida is considered a contested Senate race between Senator Rick Scott, the incumbent, and Debbie Mucarsel Powell, the challenger. I don't know that that's considered as competitive as some of the other places. So, which states are you primarily going to be watching with a sense of whether, where control could go in the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's 34 of the Senate's 100 seats are up for election right now. Most of those we know which way they're going to go. There are a few states where there are crucial Senate races that will decide the balance of the who controls the Senate, no matter who the president is. Traditionally, people have been talking about the races in Ohio, Nebraska, Maryland, but more and more lately, some people are throwing Florida into that mix. And I'll explain a little bit why Florida normally wouldn't be in the mix of Senate races being watched like this with incumbent Rick Scott running, being well financed and having great name ID. Two things make me think that the Senate race in Florida could be a lot closer than some people think. One is Rick Scott's history of winning elections. He's never won any elections by huge margins. He's run against some pretty high profile Democrats, Alex Sink and Nelson and Christ. But I mean, the most he's ever won in his last three elections is by a point and a half or something like that. His last election against Nelson, he won by just 10,000
It
votes.
was a real squeaker.
He's not winning elections by 20% like DeSantis did in 2022. The other thing is you've got a lot of young new voters coming out in Florida for the Amendment 3 and 4, and a lot of female voters and a lot of young voters, and a lot of first time voters who are interested in those issues. I don't think Scott will be the favored candidate among those voters who are primarily interested in 3 and 4. That I think makes the Scott Mucarsel Powell race a lot more interesting. She's dropped late in the race. The National Democratic Party put some money into Mucarsel Powell's race, and she's been running ads. I've seen them even here in Jacksonville, which is kind of interesting. But that race could be close. And again, as it stands now, most experts predict that the Republicans will retake control of the Senate. But there are a few races, even the Texas race with Allred and Cruz. Some people are saying that that could be a surprising race. And if Texas and Florida, if we were to see surprises in those races, the Democrats could easily keep control of the Senate.
Let's just briefly talk about the House because all 435 seats are up for grabs. Republicans are currently, the majority. What's your expectation, and what are you going to be? What particular states that you're watching?
Yeah, that's a little more tricky. I just have 435 different races in a lot of different states, and again, it's hard to have any solid predictions. But I think if any factor really influences the sort of the direction of all those hundreds of races, I have to believe that the Roe v. Wade amendment is going to have a backlash. Typically in politics, you see when one party does an overreach, and it typically creates a backlash a year or two later. And I think we are going to see a backlash from the reversal of Roe v. Wade, and I think it's going to show up in a lot of those local House races. You've got abortion on the ballot in 10 states. And unlike Florida, in most of those states, you don't need a 60% supermajority. You only need a 50%. So there's 10 states where female voters are going to come out very strong and try to send a message about the reversal of Roe v. Wade.
Well, John Daigle, thank you so much for being here this morning. We'll see you in just a few short hours for our live election coverage, which starts at 7 tonight. Thank you.
Okay.
Uh,
Thank you.